And we're live. I think we're live. Yes, we are live. Okay, so Shannon, Mac, and Jinx had to bail because the dates were reorganized for the contest, and hopefully, it's still a bit up in the air, but hopefully the stream for the contest will be going out live. Hello everybody. We'll be going out live via the imvu_official channel, which if you're not subscribed to, you should probably subscribe to that. So that would be, let me, I think it is, let me just type it in the chat. twitch.tv/imvu_official. I think that's right. So if you click on that, it should take you to, whoops, it should take you to the official imvu channel, which it will be worth subscribing to. Oh, apparently we're hosting live on the channel as well, which is unexpected. So you can either watch us here now or live on the imvu channel. You're very welcome, Brig, for typing the link. So the Valentine's, so that means then that the Valentine's contest will start next Tuesday, and we're hoping that it will be at the usual time of 4 p.m. Pacific Standard, that's US, and midnight GMT UK, and that will be 8 a.m. for Never Eat Shredded Wheat, Western Australia. So, in the meantime, we can't do any Valentine's stuff today. So, what we can do is just finish off the turkey that we started. Was it Thanksgiving? I think it was Thanksgiving, and then it sort of got delayed over Christmas, and so it's been untextured all this time. So what we can do is put some of the UV mapping stuff that we've been talking about in other streams, which I shall link to as well. So that would be the previous stream, UV map like a boss in Blender. Copy, link, paste. So that's that one. And then the other one is the, well, it's the UV mapping stuff that we did with the Valentine's preview. Copy link location, copy, and paste. Yes, so if you're watching this on anything other, as Frenzy's pointing out, on a cell phone, or mobile as we call them over here, it will be tiny. But whilst we're doing this, if you've got any questions about UV maps, about related stuff, just ask them, and we'll try our best to answer them and show on stream what the answers are to the questions. So, in answer to Liana's earlier question, looks like we're making a robot Easter chickens. Well, kinda. It's just a continuation or finishing up of the robot turkey that we started a couple of weeks ago now. So what we're going to do first is modify the tail slightly and the wings just to give them a bit more shape. So right click select as usual, tab key enters edit mode, or just use the mode selector at the bottom. And they are duplicates, so editing one will edit the other. And all we're going to do is add a loop cut. Where's the tool gone? Oh, there it is. Loop cut and slide, which is that button, or you can press Ctrl R, which is the shortcut. Move the mouse over a leading edge. Essentially, you want the edge, you want to make a selection of the edge you want to split. Left click it, and then left click again to set the orientation and set the edge in place. And then we're just going to grab these edges and just make that a little bit more round. And reposition, so we can right click, and if you double tap the G key, you initiate edge slide. And that will slide along an edge, parallel pair, and you can just reposition. And then use the widget. That's a bit more round, that's okay. And that's reflected on the other side, which is good. And then for the tail, similar process. So edit mode. So what we can do here is make a multiple selection. So that's the shift key and right click. And we can do a subdivide on this. So you click that and it'll create a set of edges that split those previous selections in half. And what we can then do is similarly just reposition those to make the tail a bit more round. But because of the orientation, if we use the widget now, it'll just pull them up and make the it'll misshape the mesh. So what we can do here, we might have to do these individually, but what we can do is change the orientation of the widget. So we can either use local, which works in this instance, or we can use normal. And both will generally orientate themselves relative to the selection that you've made. And all you need to do is just grab the widget and reposition once you've changed the orientation. So again, you can see if you make an individual selection, the widget orientates itself relative to that selection. If you make multiple selections, it orientates itself relative to the multi-selection that you've made. Now for this one, we want to use scale. Hold down Shift to have more control. And just reposition those. Excellent. Right, so UV mapping. Now if you've watched the previous, the videos that were linked previously in the chat, how you unwrap something depends on how you want to use your textures. So for example, we could face select. We could unwrap this in a way that means that each major section of the project has its own individual texture. So there'd be a texture for the tail, a texture for the wings, a texture for the body, the head, and you could probably include the face and the eye, the beak and the eyes with the head, and then maybe combine the legs onto another texture. So you've essentially got 4 or 5 textures, or you can try and map the mesh sections into fewer textures, but that requires a bit more organization. So the simple way is just to do a straightforward 1 texture per major element, and the other way, which is a bit more complicated, is trying to unwrap the object as a whole as efficiently as possible. So I guess, I mean, which one would you prefer doing, or which one would you prefer to see? The quick way, relatively speaking, would be to potentially use individual images per major section of the mesh. It probably will take longer, but the more efficient way, and the way you generally should do it, is to map as much of the object to as few texture images as possible. So, question for chat: which one do you want to see? Oh, I'll save the file whilst save as 4. Individual? Okay. So, individually, this means that you have to have so that will be 1, 2, 3, maybe 4. So what we can do here then is to partially determine, it's a unwrapping, individual, or all of them. Yeah, okay, so what we'll do then, I think, is individually we'll use a lot, relatively speaking, a lot of textures, because that's generally what people will do for projects that would be derivable. So to make it as easy as possible for others to then derive from the project, you would generally use more textures, so that you isolate each of the elements that you want people to be able to derive from. So what we can do here is we can start to establish that by creating a number of materials. So let's say this one is tail. Whoops. Tail. So that's right click, and then, well, this one's already got a material. That's the default cube. So you'll have to watch the, let me see if I can find the previous. It's in here somewhere. Oh, there it is. Right, so copy link. Right, so that's the previous show where we actually made the turkey, and we used the default cube, which is still part of the object, and that has a default material assigned to it, so we don't need to do anything with that. So we can just call this body. But with the others, so it's right click, select, And all we're doing at the moment is creating a material association. We're not doing anything particularly complicated. And that's so we need to create a material. So we can either click the plus button or we can click the new button, and that creates a material with all the basic properties. We don't generally use these, but so head, and then one for wings. Now what we can do is, to help us determine which material is assigned to which element of the project, we can use the diffuse color, which is this selector here. You left click that and it opens the pop-up, and you can either left click in here or left click drag the little spot. Just drag that around and it changes the color. And to confirm, you just move the mouse away and it'll automatically close. So select one of the other areas that we've created a material for and do the same thing. And this lets us know what materials are assigned to what element of the object. So what we then need to do is determine what we want to do with things that are left over. So we've got the rivets, the feet, the beak and the eyes. Just select a different widget. So for the rivets, we can assign those to the body material. So right click select, and as they won't have a material, what we can do, instead of creating a new one or clicking the plus or the new button, we use the browse to button, click that, left click, and then we left click select the material that we want to assign to it. Same with the bottom set. So click the sphere and body. Same with the eyes. So right click select and then left click the sphere. We want head for these, and the beak, head. And then for the feet, we can probably associate those with the wings. So same again, wings. And because those are duplicates, in the same way that the wings are, assigning a material to one half or one side will automatically assign it to the other. We'll need to change this later so that these are both these duplicates become unique objects in their own right. So once we've decided that, we can assign an image which we will then UV map to the objects. So select the tail because that's the biggest part. Now a quick way to do this is to, instead of normally what you can do is adjust, if you move the mouse over the border between these two areas, so the upper area is the outliner, the bottom area is the properties panel. If you move the mouse over the border, you'll get a double-headed arrow. If you left click drag when that appears, you adjust the areas. Normally you can just do that and then make a selection using the editor selector and switch to UV image editor, which gives us this little area here. But what you can also do is use the layout, which is this selector at the top. At the moment it's on default, but if you click the little window icon, you get a list of options and we can choose UV editing. That changes the layout to this. So we've got the focus on the 3D view, and the UV image editor, which is just a flat plane and a work area. So you've got the grid, which is the available texture space, which is square by default, and then the workspace around it. So what we can do is create some images. So to do that, down at the bottom in the header, a couple of buttons, click the new button, little pop-up appears, and then we just fill in the details. So we want tail, we want this to be 256 by 256. Select the generated type as UV grid and then OK. So at the moment, if we switch to texture mode, so that's the viewport shading, that's this spherical button at the bottom. There's nothing on the mesh, but what we can do is edit mode. So we make a selection, switch to edit mode, and then just make an association with the tail or with the element that we've got selected. We can adjust the UVs and the way that the texture appears on this later. So what we're doing is essentially, so we've created some material associations. We're now creating image associations and linking those to the UVs that are currently on the objects, and then we'll adjust them later once we've, so we're doing things in steps, but grouped steps. So we've made a group of materials, we're going to make a group of images, and we're going to group assign those to their various elements of the mesh. So that one's done. So I want to do one for the body. So select those, and in here we can either click the plus button or from image, the image menu, just new image. Do the same again, so body 256, and it'll keep the same details, 256, UV grid, OK. And that will automatically assign it because we've switched to edit mode whilst we were creating the image. So select the head, do the same again, image, new image, and that's head. And we can leave that at 256 by 256, UV grid, OK. Now, of course, you've got to be mindful that if you use the same image, when you create new images, there's going to be no visual difference between them. So pay attention to, well, the only way to tell the difference is by the names that you assign to the image that you've just created. So select the head, make sure everything is selected, so that's press the A key twice, once to deselect any active selections, and then again to reselect everything, head, and then assign that. So that's assigned that. We need one for the wings. So select images, new image, call this wings, 256, 256, UV grid, OK, and that's created that. So what we'll do is we'll leave the other elements without textures for the moment. Right, so with that basic assignment, let's switch back to the default so that we can edit the UVs. So I'm going to switch to texture mode. So texture, and that shows the images that we've assigned. So a quick way, it's not necessarily the best or the most efficient, but a quick way to unwrap objects is based on selection. So as we've got the wing already selected, and again, with these being duplicates, so the left and right are duplicates of one another, anything that you do to one is immediately shown on the other. So a quick way to unwrap is to switch to edit mode and make a selection. So switch to face select, and using right click and shift right click, just right click the faces that you want to UV. Unwrap. Now if you want more control over how these are editable, you can switch back to UV editing and it'll show the UVs that you've selected in the editor space, or if you're in the default view, just switch the editor to the UV, well that's the outliner, switch the outliner editor, which is that one, which is the default, switch that to the UV editor and you'll get the same thing. So what you can do is switch this top area just so that you've got the UVs visible, so whilst you're working in the main 3D view it makes it easier to see what the correlation between the two views. And then once you've made your selection, just press the U key or mesh, unwrap, unwrap, and that'll give us a warning about the object being a duplicate and or a shaped object. So that will be, so if we switch out of, we should see an indication of that, yes, with the scale. So when you, it's not necessarily complicated, but when you shape an object, if you shape it in object mode, so if I press, let's use the scale widget. So using the scale widget, switch to solid mode, this is easy to see. If you're in object mode and you scale and shape things, it changes the overall dimensions of the object. So it'll rescale it and change the values here. If you then do something to this like we're doing with UV maps, the UV map that's unwrapped is not relative to the actual shape that you've modified the object to, it's relative to the original shape of the object, which would have been the cube. So to avoid problems like that, what you need to do, and this is where, can we see Mark? What marks? You mean mark seams, Frenzy? Is that what you mean? Delay whilst stream catches up. Need some incidental music whilst stream catches up. And that is quite a delay. Well, I think Frenzy was asking about, I should say, mark seams, which are only visible in edit mode. Yes, she was. We could probably do it on one of the other elements. So mark seams are edges, mark seam. And what that does, actually we can do that with this element that we've got selected. So switch back to. So on the scale and the error message that pops up, so to fix that in object mode, you have to use Control A, which is apply, or from the object menu, apply, and we want rotation and scale. Location is implied when you use rotation and scale, but we'll get an error message saying that it can't do that. So what we can do is tentatively, well, we'll give it a temporary UV map so that both wings are UV'd, and then we can make them unique or individual objects. So edit mode, so UV map these using selections, and that's one wing or one side. And then what we can do is move, so this is double-sided, or the view is double-sided. So to make this easier, this actually helps solve a number of other problems or related problems. We can see the inside of this cube, so we can't tell which way these faces are pointing. So we can solve this in view properties. So if you press the N key, it brings up view properties, and it's this option here, backface culling. So if we, let's zoom inside the box. So if we go inside the cube and enable, so we select and activate that, the inside of the box disappears. And this is a quick way of determining which side or which way faces are orientated, and we'll see this, or see the problem that this solves in a little bit when we make the wings, or the duplicate wing and foot, unique objects. But for now we'll continue making our selection based UV mapping. So we've made our selection, press the U key, and then we want unwrap, and again the message pops up. Same again with the top or the edge. So what we can do here is, make that one selection, unwrap that, so we get a line. That's one section, and then shift right click all of these to make another selection and unwrap, and that creates another grouping. So that's the wing essentially unwrapped. We can adjust this later, and again, because it's a duplicate, it does it on the same side, on the opposite side as well. So we'll do the same thing with the tail. So switch out of edit mode, make a selection, back into edit mode for that, and what we can do here is make a broader selection. We can select the front and the back of the tail, press the U key, unwrap, and that'll give us two tail shapes. And then we can do the same thing we did with the wing with the edge of the tail. And we can miss or leave the bottom face unselected so that we break the loop, because that's a loop of edges or a loop of faces. And if we select that and unwrap it, I'll switch to edit mode just to make this easy to see. So if we unwrap a complete loop, it'll distort the UV. So U unwrap, and this is the shape that it produces, which distorts the texture, assigns to the face. So if we deselect a loop that a face that's not visible, we can use that to force the UV to unwrap itself properly. So if we do U, press the U key again now and unwrap, what we'll get is a linear UV section, which unwraps, relatively speaking, properly relative to the selection. And then we can just select that last face and just unwrap that as well. It doesn't matter so much about this one because it's generally hidden from view, or partially, well, it's almost completely hidden actually, but that's hidden from view, so we can use that to our advantage when we're unwrapping things like this. Instead of using a seam or making the UV more complicated, we just make a selection of stuff that's visible and use that to unwrap. So that's the tail. And for the sides, so what we can do here is, because in the previous video we used, did we use sharp edges? I think we used sharp edges. Yes, we did. We used sharp edges. So what we can do here is unwrap. Whoops. We can unwrap. Let me disable. If you are, by default, when you switch to UV editing mode, you can make selections through the mesh, which can be, because the mesh is, or the display is essentially transparent, which causes selection problems. It has its advantages and disadvantages. So to disable that, click this little button with the little spheres on it, and the back face selection feature will disable, so you can no longer see through the mesh. So with that done, what we can do is select the top of the box, switch back to texture mode, and we can unwrap this selection. So U key, unwrap. It might do that, which is not quite sure why it does that, but if we now go around the box and make side specific selections, press the U key, so again, and then let's do the front on its own. Oh, that's already done. And then do the back, and then we can combine the edges with the sides. So we shift right click those, unwrap, and then do the same on the other side. And unwrap. And then we need to do that for the head as well. So we want the top this is one thing that you do need to be aware of. If you switch between, so you might note, so we're looking at the inside of the turkey and we're in UV editing layout. If we switch to the default layout, it's in wireframe, which is not the same as UV editing. So the layouts it's a useful thing to keep in mind, but it's also something that catches you out occasionally. The layouts keep the settings or the display settings that you assign to each view relative to the individual layout. So using UV editing, we can now see the inside of the cubes or these shapes which we previously disabled. So you'd have to go back over, so press the N key, N for Nigel, press the N key and then disable that option again, and we've got the inside of the cube invisible now. So that's something to keep in mind as you switch between layouts rather than views. So continue with the top unwrap. Do the bottom. Unwrap. Do the back. That's probably already done, it is. And then the front. And then combine the edges with the sides. And again, so now we've got to decide what we want to do with the eyes and the beak and the feet and the rivets. So is this making sense so far in terms of the basics of selection-based unwrapping? Because this avoids making the project overly complicated, but at the well, it avoids making it overly complicated for the advantage of making the object easily derivable by other individuals when they derive from your objects, because all they need to do essentially is replace the images that you've assigned previously to the object, but they don't have to do anything particularly complicated. So for example, if you were to, let me save this so that we have so we'll save the file at this point for number 5. Because even though these are cubes, how you actually unwrap the final thing in terms of what each section of the UV does, or how it's positioned relative to your image, is going to determine actually how you want the thing to be unwrapped. Because what you could do is use so if this checkered image were a rusty texture, when you're unwrapping the object or mapping the object, you want to make sure that the elements are all approximately the same size. Because this ensures that you end up with an even distribution of the image across the object. Yeah, so chat's just now responding to what we were saying earlier. So yes, as Leonia says, right, makes a mesh more texture artist friendly and easy to make an object unique from what others do when they texture. Yeah. And then Frenzy's asked, I've been having issues with beveling. Maybe at the end we can have... yes, yeah, we'll, if we have time, depending on how long we carry on with this, we'll just go over beveling a little bit. So back to texturing, yeah, so yes. So once you've got your object unwrapped, you then have to make sure that each of the elements, that's a little bit wonky, but we'll address that later, are approximately the same size. So if this front face, it'll be the front face and the back face in this instance, they both occupy the entirety of the texture because they're essentially square. But the sides and the top, so let's just select the side, move that to one side. The sides, oops, get rid of that panel. The sides and the top don't. So what it's done, it's unwrapped the UV relative to the texture space to try and keep the UV inside the contained area that we've got available. But what this does is it means that your texture density, or rather the distribution of the image, is different. So what you may end up with, if you're not careful, so if we alter this back to its original-ish size, which was about that. Oh, that's the bottom. So the checker, the size of the checker, indicates that there's a disparity between the elements because the size of the UV differs. So for an object like this is a relatively straightforward problem to solve, because what you do is you use the inside face, you use that as your size guide. So you would then scale up the texture, or the UV rather, so that that selected face fits approximately within the bounds. You'll get some overlap, but that then means that the texture density for that section of the UV is exactly the same as it is for the front. For an object like this, that's a relatively straightforward problem to solve, but for more complicated shapes, it requires a bit more, well, trial and error basically. So we'll just quickly do that for the other elements whilst we are in that mode, and the same again for the sides. So those can be scaled up, which pushes the edges, it pushes the edges outside the UV, but it makes sure that the inside, the main area, is the same size as all the other elements. And then of course you can then go back over the UVs and do a better job of aligning them to the texture. And it helps if in the UVs menu there's an option to snap to pixels. So if you enable that, what that does is it then snaps. I don't know if this comes through on the stream, but as you move the UV selection, it judders or steps because it's snapping to the individual pixels of the image that's available. And this being a 256 by 256, the snaps or the steps are more visible. So what we'll do is go over the other elements. In fact, actually what we can do is UV map the rivets using the body texture. So right click, select them, enter edit mode, and we can assign the image, the body image, to those objects. So body, so that gives us their default UVs, which is essentially called reset, which is this option at the bottom. But what we can do is unwrap them. So we get a set of spheres, and we can do the same thing with the bottom. So select the object, right click, enter edit mode, and then assign the image in the UV image editor and unwrap. A quick way to unwrap, actually, instead of going back and forth between the two views, because the mouse, the function is context sensitive, so if you use the U key, you have to have the mouse over the 3D view. But if the mouse is over the texture edit view, so if I just reset this, so mouse over the 3D view, press the U key, and it unwraps or gives us the menu options. But in the UV image editor, we can press the E key, and that'll unwrap for us without having to go back and forth between the two views. So we've got the rivets done, we've got the body done, we've kind of got the head done. So let's quickly just do that. Same treatment. So we use the inside face, which is the largest area, as our defining characteristic. Whoops, for the size of the UV. It doesn't matter that it's wonky at the moment. And again, the same for the sides. So stretch those out. So this is the UV image editor doesn't have any widget controls. It doesn't have a widget like the 3D view, but the same functions work, and the shortcut keys are G for grab or translate, move. So if I press a G key, and then we've got rotate, which is the R key, R for Robert or Roger, and then we've got the S key for scale. No idea why they don't have a widget for the 2D view for the editor. So that's the head, the body, and the wings done. So for the beak and wing, so what we can do for the beak and the eyes is put those on their own texture, actually. So switch back to default, switch to texture mode, looking at the turkey's butt. Actually switch back to solid mode so that we can see the material assignment. Select the beak, and as it's already got a material assigned, what we can do is use that assignment and create a unique instance of it. So what this will do is it should duplicate the material properties that we've got, but create a unique instance of it by appending a number. So if I press where it says 4, that means that there are 4, doesn't necessarily mean that there are 4 actual objects, the way that Blender works, it means that there are 4 references to this single material. So we want to make this, in clicking this, we reduce the references to this material and create a unique one from it. So we'll click that, and as you can see, it appends a number to that. So what we can do is call this beak. And then if we change its color, we can see that that's now a unique material. And then do one for the eyes. So same again, using the same material that's assigned to it. Click the numerical button. That creates a new instance. We call this eyes. Change its color. Let's go red. And again, so that's left click the patch or the color sample area, left click that, brings the pop-up, and then left click anywhere in here or left click drag to actively move it around, and then just move the mouse away and it'll disappear. So we want to assign the same material to the other eye. So right click, and using the material selector, just select eyes. So that now means that we have, so if I switch back to texture mode, we now need to, oh, that looks quite funny actually. So we now need to assign textures to these elements. So let's do the beak first. And switch back to UV editor. Create a new image. So image, new image. What was beak? 256 by 256. Yep, that's all right. UV grid. So okay. And then in edit mode, make a selection and then assign the beak. So that gives us a wonky UV map based on the shape of the object. So what we can do here with this is, rather than making a selection based unwrap where we select the faces that we want, what we can do here is use a seam. So what we want is to switch selection mode to edge. So you click the middle button down at the bottom here, right click, and this makes use of the fact that there's a sharp edge there which helps define a lower beak versus an upper beak. So we shift right click those two edges that were already marked with sharp, and from the mesh menu, edges, mark seam. Probably can't see it here because sharp edges override seams, but if I switch back to default mode, get a little bit closer to that, and then in the view properties panel, N key again, we have this mesh display section. We can enable or disable certain edge markings. So it's always worth doing that if you've got something marked up with sharp edges and you can't see any seams that you've just marked. Just come into here and disable them. So now that we know that those are marked, what we can then do, also we need to isolate the back. So just that was a loop select. So holding down the Alt key, right click one of the edges and it'll select the entire loop, which in this instance selects an entire face as well because it's an n-gon. Yes, gobble gobble. It was supposed to be a project for, funnily enough, Thanksgiving, but delays, etc., mean that it's now a January turkey, whatever happens in January. So mark an edge there, edges, mark seam, and then what we can do is unwrap the entire thing. So what we want to do here is select, make sure that we've got everything selected, which we have. I'll switch back for clarity, and then just press the U key and unwrap. And what that does is it creates several sections. You need to be mindful of the orientation of shapes like this. That is one thing that if you use seams and you split the mesh up like this, when you do a group selection, let me just double check that it actually does do that. When you make a group selection, the orientation of the faces or the UVs may not necessarily be optimal. So if I just, you see it switches the UV around. So when you make a broader selection, when there are more elements, you get this orientation. But when you make an individual selection, you might get that orientation. So that is something to be aware of. So that's the beak. Now I need to do the eye. And I think, are these individual eyes? I think these are individual eyes. So what we can do here is just do one of them. So image, new eyes. These can be smaller, so 128 by 128, or maybe even 64 by 64. Grid, okay. And so that's assigned it to the selected face that we had because we're in edit mode. So press A to deselect that, and then again to select everything, and then reassign that image. And it reassigns it to everything. We need to adjust the size of those cylinders, but we can do that later. So seams again for this. So switching back to default mode. Are we in? No, we're in edge select. Alt right click, that selects the entire surface, and for this we will need to do the front and the back. So to do a multiple loop select, so that's Alt right click, let me just deselect, that's Alt right click to select the loop, and then if we need to make another loop select, that's Alt Shift right click, and that'll make another loop selection. And then we can add again to this by just using the Shift key and right click. We can select an individual edge, and what we want to do here is mark seams. So we've marked a seam all the way around the edge, and what this will do, this edge that's marked running along the bottom, this will split the cylinder and lay the edge out flat. So we select all of that, I'll switch back for clarity again. I press the U key, so we get that. So that's the front, which you probably want to occupy most of the texture space. And that's the side. And depending on how you want the eye to actually appear, because if you do that white, let's say you do a normal, a typical eye, so you have most of the texture is white with a spot in the middle for the iris. Where you position this is going to matter relative to the texture that appears. So if you move that to the edge, it'll be white as well. The same with the back. You can leave that tiddly because it's not seen, and that'll be white. But if you place the edge over the middle, you'll get the black spot appearing. The curse of the black spot. But what you can do here, excuse me, if you want one texture for both eyes, what you can now do is just delete the other eye, or move it. So that's the M key, just move it to a layer that's not used, and then duplicate this eye, so that's Shift D, and then move it over to the other side. Or if you wanted two eyes and each had a unique texture, you would then have to UV unwrap the other eye as an individual, so you would end up with, so we've got eyes, but what you would end up with if you wanted individual textures per eye, you would have eye left and eye right. Or would that be irate? And then the last thing to do is the turkey's feet. Now these will be tricky because of their shape. So for these more complicated shapes, it's best to use seams. So make your selection, and again, because they are duplicates, what we haven't done is assign an image to those. So UV editor for clarity again. Image, new image, feet. 128 by 128, that's fine. Let's UV grid, okay. Edit mode, select all, and then assign the image feet. Same issue with the feet that we have with the eyes. Well, it's actually with the wings as well. So we've used duplicates for quite a few elements of this, and to simplify the process, we've essentially just relied on the fact that they are duplicates. So each wing, the eye, and the foot, when we eventually get to it, uses the same texture. So that basically means the object is exactly the same on the left as it is on the right. If you wanted to switch that up and change it so that, let's say for the sake of argument, the turkey was to have a, what colour is the material? So it's a sort of pinkish colour on one side. So if somebody were to do a pink wing on one side and a blue wing on the other, because they are using the same material and the same image, that's not possible. So whatever you assign to one side would be assigned automatically to the other side in imvu when somebody's deriving from it. So that's another consideration that I have to think about, that if you want to enable or allow difference, you have to set up the object so that each left-right side is using a separate texture. So that would be for anything that, so we've got wings, the eyes, and then the feet. So if you wanted to allow people to create difference left to right, you'd need to make sure that you're using multiple or individualized textures and material assignments per object. So friends, does this have to snap to center mode in the UV editor function? So you mean when... I'm not quite sure what you mean there, Frenzy. So if you... When you... Well, by default, if I understand what you're asking, by default, the action that you perform is centered on the texture space that's available in the UV image editor. So with this being square, it's pretty much dead center. If this were a rectangle, it would still be relative to the center of the texture space. So let's say, for the sake of argument, half of this wasn't there. The manipulation would still be centered on the available space. But you can change that by changing what's called the pivot point or the focus point, which is, well, there are several options. I think it's this one. Yeah. It works the same way as it does in the 3D editor, where you can make selections and manipulate things based on various aspects of the objects within the scene or the scene itself. So the UV image editor works the same way. So you have the same or similar. If you note that we've got these options in the UV image editor, the pivot point, and similar in the 3D view. So you can change them Yes, passing notes to other students and get you a detention. So changing the pivot point changes how changes the behavior of your manipulation. So if you note that the 2D cursor is in this bottom right corner, left corner, if we switch to the 2D cursor and scale again, press the S key, the function or the action occurs relative to the cursor. So if you click somewhere, doesn't matter where it is, the action, occurs relative to the cursor. But by default, it's usually the bounding box, which is the entire texture space. So back to what we'll be doing, feet. So select the foot, and for this, the easiest thing to do is, well, because it's a complicated shape, mark seams. So switch to edit mode. Because the challenge, what you kind of want to avoid doing is what is currently happening right now, which is a reset And what this does is it treats each face individually. So the entire image is UV mapped, is UV mapped per face, which basically means you've got a lot, you end up with a heck of a lot of individual UV elements. You want to try and avoid that as much as possible so that you have groups. So what we want to do is place UV seams around the object so that we split it up into groups. So what we can do here, so switch to edge select, and we can shift right click these inner edges because we don't need to select the face itself, just the edge, just the perimeter. Mark these, so mark, edges, mark seam, same on the bottom. So let's just switch back to solid mode to make this quicker. Shift right click, switch to edge select, and then deselect these inside edges so that we get an outline. And then again, edges, mark seam, and to the simplest way to then unwrap the edge, this loop around the edge, is just to mark one of the inside edges that are hidden from view with a seam. So edge, mark seam, and then of course we need to do the leg. So you want to do the inside back edge because that's less likely to be seen. Oh, and we have to do the top and bottom of this because we kept the shape simple. So seams. In fact, actually what we can do with that is, well, you'll see. If we deselect one of the edges, the bottom and top face will still be attached to the main elements or the main area of this leg section. So you're essentially unwrapping it like a cardboard box so that you flatten the whole thing out as a single unit, rather than if we marked edges everywhere we end up with separate faces, and we want to try and avoid that. So mark that as an edge, as a seam rather, and then we should be able to do the entire thing. So deselect active selections, press the A key again to reselect everything, and unwrap. We'll switch to texture mode so we can see this. And what that does is it creates all these nice little elements for us. And again, because we've unwrapped several objects at the same time, it tries to fit all of them within the space that we've got. But the important bits for this, we can just resize. And depending on how detailed or what you want the texture to look like, you would then just adjust the position of the elements that you've got to use more or less space. So for instance, we could rotate the leg around, reposition the feet, and then put that in the middle so that we're optimizing the amount of space that's used. Sorry, I was just reading. Liana's saying this makes me want to make a turkey in honor of Tom Turkey, who just passed. Oh, it's one of the turkeys on the farm. Yes, so they had a Liana MC had a turkey on the farm called Tom. Frenzy asked why was it named Tom, or why are they always named Tom? And Liana said, well, it's just because it was easy. And again, so back to the unwrapping. So again, because we're using a duplicate object, what we've got, and it's mirrored as well. They are mirrored. So looking at the texture distribution, we've got these yellow plus signs. We've got them on the left, on the right leg, and on the right, on the left leg, because the object's mirrored. And that just about is the object completely unwrapped. So let's save the file. Save. Now, as mentioned in the mentioned earlier, what you do next depends very much on how you want this to be derivable by people. Because if you want it to be derivable simply, then what you would do, as mentioned earlier, is just make each of the duplicate objects unique in terms of being able to then export a finished mesh. So everything, the left and the right side, use the same material, the same image, but they're just opposite sides of the mesh. Or if you want to provide a unique experience, then you would have to set up your materials accordingly, so that you would, when you make the objects unique so that you can export them, you then have to adjust the material and texture assignments. So what we'll do, how long have we got? About 30 minutes, I guess. So the quickest thing is going to be the simplest thing. So what I'll do is switch back to default. And I'll make the duplicates unique, but using the pre-assigned materials. So they are essentially duplicates. The left and the right are duplicates of one another. So how can you tell? There is a way to do it, but I can't remember where it is. There is a way to tell, but yeah, I can't remember where it is. Is that it? That's it. Okay, yeah. Excuse me. Right. So the way to tell whether something is a duplicate of something else is if that when you right-click select it and you go into Object Data Properties, this section at the top should display, as it does for the cube, it should just display cube and this button with the F, letter F on it, which means fake user. So if I select the wing, it changes and we have a numerical button which, similar to the materials, is telling us that this object has two references, which is the left and the right object. So that's telling us that this is duplicate. This has been duplicated, so this one is the duplicate. So if we select either of these, doesn't matter which one, we'll get the same information. But the name will be different. And this is how Blender can do duplicate objects. So to fix that, to make this easier, go into texture mode, and this is where disabling backface culling comes into play. So we select the duplicate that we created, object mode, and we want make single user object and data. And if you watch what the mesh does, it should essentially flip inside out. And we'll get this little confirmation, selected objects. Oh, and it didn't do it. So you're going to do it for the other side then, just to double check. Make single user, object and data, single object. Normally when you do that, it flips the duplicate, it flips it inside out because the object is mirrored. And what mirroring tends to do is it mirrors everything, so it not only flips the object left to right, but it also flips the orientation of the individual faces of the object inside out. But it hasn't done it in this instance. So let's try it with the feet. So this also then now means that that object is editable on its own. The same with the other one. So we can edit this and it won't change the other one. But the feet will, because they're still linked objects. So we need to select the duplicate and make that single user, because that again has the same property markers, if you like, the numerical button. So that should disappear. So make single user, object and data. And that hasn't. That's most odd. Oh, now Blender is very odd sometimes. But that's created. Oh, it hasn't done it. Why hasn't it done it? That should have. That should have created a unique object. So let's do that again. Object, make single user, object and data, selected object. Oh, it's because we didn't confirm. Yeah, so the numerical reference has disappeared and the object name has been updated and appended with a unique name, which in this instance is just a number. But that means that we can now edit each of these individually. But now that that's done, if you wanted to, you could go back over the UVs that you've assigned to these. For instance, you could combine the wings if you wanted to. Well, actually, we could do a couple of things. We can leave the wings as they are. So we've got a front and back, and it's the same UV for both. And what you would want to do for export is join these together because they use the same material. So you select both meshes, object, where is it? There it is, join. It creates a single object out of both of them, which then means that what you have is a duplicated, or well, both wings use exactly the same UV placement. Now doing that, join has inverted the faces of the original. So to fix that, you can either do recalculate or flip direction when you're making specific selections. And that will probably happen for the legs as well. So if you select those, join, shortcut key is Control J. Yeah, the original flips inside out. So select them all, recalculate, and that flips them the right way out. And again, the UVs sit exactly on top of one another. So you could, once you've joined everything together, you could leave everything as is for simplicity's sake, or you could edit the UVs further and make things more interesting in terms of making them more unique. So the next step then would be just tidying up the UVs relative to the amount of space that they've used. And then setting the item up as a furniture item, or well, or a pet or something like that. So let me just save this. So did all of that make sense whilst I'm saving this? It is relatively straightforward, but as mentioned in the previous sessions, how you unwrap something, the actual process of unwrapping is pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. Even if, I mean, you don't need to use seams, because selection-based unwrapping is often, particularly for simple projects, is relatively easy to do and straightforward. The complexities of UV unwrapping isn't the process, it's how you want the UV to be used relative to the image that you're mapping to the object. So you have to make your decisions in terms of how you actually unwrap the object. Your decisions have to be relative to the images that you're using or that you've assigned to, or you want people to be able to derive from. And I think that's probably, thinking about it, that's probably where people get tripped up frequently with UVs is that they overcomplicate the process. So what you probably want to do first is try and establish the size of the textures that you want and the type of textures, and whether you want the object to be derivable or easily derivable, and then work from that. Once you've got your derivation properties established in your own head, you can then unwrap the object relative to those requirements. Yes, they do, Liana. They do like objects that are easy to texture. So again, so Liana is saying, I know this was my issue, trying to figure out how to unwrap for easy deriving. Yeah, and that's the thing. If this were an object that you were the only one that had access to, or you were the only one using, it wouldn't matter what you did. But to make it easier for other people to derive, you have to start thinking in terms of what they would want from the object to make it easily derivable. So probably the simplest thing to do is to establish how you want the thing to look, obviously, but how you want it to look relative to the textures that you want to use, and then unwrap relative to the ease of use it would then be to unwrap for somebody that's deriving. Yes, so was Liana's also pointing out that complaints from other people that have bad UV maps, and this is one of the things that you want to consider as well, is that if you unwrap objects like this, so you're essentially doing a one-to-one UV mapping, you don't necessarily need to provide a wireframe for this, because the texture itself pretty much defines the shape of the object, the UV, because it fits essentially within the main areas of the UV as one-to-one. So you could have just a rusty metal texture with rust artifacts around the edge or the perimeter of the texture, and those would fit neatly within the space that you've defined. Or if you do that, you would then need to adjust again. So this is where a bit of forethought comes into play, because although we've got these UVs adjusted to fit the main face or the main area, if you do so if you, using the example of the rust around the rim or the perimeter, what you would end up with is rust around this inner edge, where we actually wanted rust around this outer edge. So you would then have to adjust your UVs again so that you get that effect. So what you're then doing is fitting the entire UV selection itself. So that's maybe several faces inside the parameter, or the perimeter I should say, of the image, which then means that the rust, so what that would do is with these upper faces you would have the rust effect, because these outer edges, the perimeter of this selection, this UV selection, fit within the texture space. But for the sides you would have the rust effect going down the left and the right side, but not across the top, because its width fits within the UV's within the texture space, but not its height. So you have to pay attention to things like that as well. So how the texture relates to other elements of the object. So yes, that's something that you have to be aware of as well. But that also then means that when somebody's deriving from this, from something as simple as this particular shape, you don't have to provide a UV map for them, or a UV map overlay that they can paint over. But for shapes like the wings, you might have to. So this would mean having to adjust the UVs so that the front and the back. Let me just quickly do this. For example, so because we unwrap those separately, the UVs overlap, which you want to try and avoid. The overlap. So you have to consider, so if I unwrap these now, what we get is two individual islands. So now we have to start thinking about they're using up a relatively small amount of space of the texture because the texture's square. So what we have to start thinking about is, can we adjust the texture? Press the N key, and then in this instance we can. Is that one? That one? Yeah, I think it's that one. Let me just, whoops, that's the wrong one. But we can adjust the texture to compensate, so that if we now redo the UV map, what we end up with is the UVs fitting more space within 512 by 256, which is, you know, a rectangle. So again, there's another thing that you have to think about. Yeah, so as Liana say, it's why I always tell people I talk to who want to mesh, start out texturing first so one understands what might be needed to allow texture artists to make a mesh unique from what others do. I find if I can't do that with a mesh, I bypass it more times than not. So yes, so if you're making a derivable, let's assume that people aren't doing zero change derivations, so they're deriving from the object and not doing anything to them. The whole point of deriving is to make the object unique. But if you unwrap your object in a way that makes that difficult, they're less likely to derive from it. So you've got to weigh up how easy the object is to derive versus how unique do you want that derivation to be. And the proper way to do it would be to combine elements together. Whoops, what happened there? Oh, it's a scaling thing. What should have happened here is that what it should have done is unwrapped. I'll just do this quickly. It should have unwrapped all of these elements. To fit within the space of this one UV. But the problem with that for derivers is that it actually makes it very complicated to texture, because it becomes quite fiddly. So there are a number of ways you can address those problems. For instance, as we mentioned earlier, you can assign specific materials to each aspect of the mesh or, as would be the case with the wings, because the back side is not visible, what you can do, so if I unwrap these, so which is the back? That's the front. So what we can do with these is make a selection of the back faces. So let's double check we've got those selected. We have. We can flip them. So that's Control M with the cursor over the image editor. And then X. Yeah, so it's X or Y. So X flips left to right. Y flips top to bottom. So you want left to right. And then what we can do is just move that section over the front. So that we now have more space available for the other set of wings, or the other wing, which you would then unwrap, but to the other side. And then you do the same process. So you select the inside, outside, unwrap. So which one's the, so that's the outside, that's the inside, so we mirror that and drop that over the outside. And that then means that we can fit both pairs of wings onto the texture and essentially make it easy for people to derive from. So you would have to provide this wireframe, but because you've distributed the UVs so that you've got one wing on one half and one wing on the other half, it just basically means that they could literally, the derivers could literally just drop different colors onto either side of the texture, and that would give them their unique unique interpretation of whatever it is that they're thinking of doing to the mesh. Yes, so that is actually one of the reasons, Liana's pointing out again in chat, it's one of the reasons why people mesh or start meshing, is because they go to derive from something and find out that it doesn't work quite the way that they want it to, so they learn how to mesh and create their own content. So I guess in terms of how you would think about your project is that you start with, the first question you ask is whether you want the object to be something that you use or whether you want it something you want others to derive from it. If it's the former, it's something just for you. It doesn't matter what you do. You can do whatever you want. You can unwrap the thing as messily as you like, so long as you end up with whatever it is that you want to end up with. But if it's going to be derivable, you have to start thinking about how somebody else is going to approach, or how easy it's going to be for somebody to texture it based on whatever it is that you are doing. So you have to start thinking about the UV maps and unwrapping and texture assignments and all those related elements relative to what somebody else is going to do or is thinking or might be thinking as they're trying to work with your object. And that's the key, that's probably the key difference, because that changes the way, as we've gone through today, that changes a lot of things with respect to UV maps and how you unwrap your objects, because you can be really, really messy and it doesn't matter so long as the end result fits whatever it is that you want. But you have to be much more thoughtful if it's going to be used by somebody else. So, has that? It's a bit. I think this is one of the problems with UV maps, is that people tend to think that it's both simple and complicated at the same time. But as we've gone over the turkey, it's complicated not because the UV process itself is complicated, but because we're dealing with all sorts of different shapes. Let me just save this file again. So we've got a 8. So it's complicated because we're dealing with all sorts of different shapes and forms, and we have to think about how that relates to a derivable object. But in terms of the actual process of UV mapping itself, it is actually relatively straightforward, particularly because the simplest form of unwrapping is just selection based. You make your selection, shift right click, and then just unwrap, and that's it. That's as simple as UV unwrapping is. But obviously it changes based on the shape of the objects that you're using, the complexity of the mesh, the complexity of the overall object, and how many textures you want to use. So that's our turkey textured, finally. But what you then need to do, actually, once these are all temporary textures. So once you've got everything set up, so what we've done is we've created a material, and we've created a texture. Let me just switch to, and we've created a texture for each of them. Now I can't remember if this is if you're using Cal 3D to export, then you have to do this. But with FBX, I'm not sure if you need to do this. But so we've got our materials assigned. What we then need to do is create texture properties for each of them. So that's body, for example. And then we need to set an image, a type, and we want image or movie. Just click both so that we can see a sphere, so we can see the material. And then what we need to do is assign the image that we created, and that's UV mapped to the object. We need to make a link between that image and the material that it's associated with, because at the moment what we've essentially got are two independent blocks of data. If you think about them as bricks, Lego bricks. So what we've got are four. Well, at the moment we've got 3 Lego bricks. We've got a Lego brick that represents the mesh. We've got a Lego brick that represents the material. That's this. And then we've got a Lego brick that represents the texture. At the moment, although they are all assigned relative to what we're looking at in... Oh, it's frozen again. It periodically does this. And we just have to wait for it to untwist its knickers. So, using the Lego brick analogy, so we've got, continuing with that, so we've got a Lego brick for the mesh, a Lego brick for the material, a Lego brick for the image. And what we've also got, when this decides to function, there we go, we've also got a Lego brick for texture properties, we need to, as you do with Lego bricks, we need to connect them all together as a series of so that instead of having the 4 independent bricks, we have one object of 4 bricks. And we can do that with so once you've created your material, you can create a set of texture properties that links the material properties and texture properties together as a block, and then down in the image subsection, click the picture icon and select the, in this instance it's the body image. So that now links the image with the texture, which is linked to the material. So we now have 3 Lego bricks linked together as a block. And because that material is assigned to the object, that now completes the foursome. So we now have a Lego brick construction that is one object that's comprised from 4 Lego bricks, but they're all linked together now. And you'd need to do that for all of your materials. So tail. So this doesn't have any material texture properties, so we have to create them. So you can either, again, there isn't a plus button here, so click the new button, it populates, left click in there, type a name, both, again picture icon, left click, and we want tail, and that changes the preview. Wings, same again, new, wings. Image or movie is already selected, generally because it remembers or uses the same settings as set up in the first material that we created. Both. Wings. Yep. Feet. Oh, is that using the wings material? Did we change that? Aha. So we didn't change that. So what we can do here, click the numerical button again. This will duplicate the material and make it unique with the numerical append 001. So if we left click and just change this to feet, and we'll have to do the same again for this because this was associated with the wings. So we have to click the numerical button. That creates a unique instance, call this feet. And now I have to do the same again down here and call that feet, but then select Pt.2. Oops, and it's not going to do it now because, whoops. So this is where it gets a bit tricky because sometimes Blender is stubborn with its material associations. So even though we actually had a separate texture assigned for the wings, which is this rectangle, and a separate texture for the feet, which is this much smaller square, because we used the same material initially, so that was wings until we made it unique, and that was wings until we made that unique. The trouble sometimes is that what it'll do is it'll sometimes stick with the wrong material assignment, the wrong image assignment. So you may find that what you have to do when this occurs is save the file, because what it's done, don't know if you noticed, but it's created an instance of feet but there's this little 0 next to it. That 0 indicates that there's nothing, 0, there's no, nothing's using that, but it keeps it temporarily in memory, and you can't get rid of them whilst it's in memory. So what you have to do to solve that is save the file, and again it's still there, and then reload, and that should remove it, which it has done. And that then means you can then change the name of the image reference. Let's change its color as well, so that we know that we're dealing with separate materials. So go round the, oh, and the head. So we've got to do the head. Image or movie, both. Head, beak. Image or movie, both. Beak. And then the eyes. And that makes sure, oh, did we do the tail? Yes, we did the tail. Oh, we haven't done the rivets. Oh, those use the body, so that's okay. So again, even though these are separate objects, because they use the same material as the body, whatever you do to the material, so whatever you do to the body material also then applies to the rivet material, because they're the same. So that now means that as a basic item, so let's say for the sake of argument there was a furniture root node here, you could export this to FBX and import it into imvu. But you might, it might not be necessary for you to do that with FBX, but you will do for Cal3D. So make sure your materials are properly set up. And that will just about do it for our turkey and today. So if there are any questions about what we've just been doing, ask away. So let me save this, save as 10. Could we animate the turkey another time? Liana's asking. Yes, that kind of was the intention originally, but as mentioned at the beginning of the stream, we never got round to that because of stuff. What is it? RL got in the way. But yes, this could be... oh, that was what we were going to do. Yes, we were going to turn this into a an animated seat. So the avatar. No, we didn't. It's not in an avatar file. So the avatar basically sat on this as a seat, and the turkey would hop around with the avatar sat on it. So. Yes, I mean it would be an animated furniture item with a seat node. So that's possible. Just have to think about that because if you use Cal 3D, you would set it up one way, but if you were using FBX, you could set it up a slightly different way that's actually simpler and easier to do. Oh, beveling, yes. So let me just save over the... Right, so new scene. So we'll just quickly go over beveling. There we go. Right, so you've got your... There are two... yes, there are two ways of doing this. Let me just double check. Yeah, right. The way you can do it so that you've got greater control over which elements you select are beveled, you do it manually. So you switch to edit mode, obviously. You make your selection, say this top vertex, from the mesh menu. Now is it in... I know what the shortcut key is, but where is it in the menu? There it is. Bevel. I don't think... Oh, yes, it is. Yeah, so depending on... Yeah. So depending on the selection mode that you're in, so if we switch to faces, edges, or vertices, the control differs to activate it. So for vertices, it's Shift Control B. For edges, it's Control B. And for faces, that's also Control B. But doing it this way, you have complete control over how the bevel affects the mesh because it's selection based. So even with, I think it does work. Yeah, it does do it, but nothing seems to happen. So vertices, let's see what this does. Shift Control B, there we go. So you make your selection, right click, depending on your selection mode. So let me right click to just reset that. So depending on your mode of selection, whether you're in edge, face, or vertex, you initiate using whatever shortcut key or menu option you want. And then, I don't know if you'll see it in the stream, but there's a dotted or dashed line between the selection that you've made and the mouse cursor. If you drag, that affects the display, that affects your selection. And you can either manually bevel something or you can type a value. So if you look at the bottom of the screen, whoops, it won't do it now. But the header area, which at the moment is showing the default buttons and options that we have for editing. So when we activate the tool, it switches to a series of numbers and all sorts of options that we've got. And if to the right side there's the offset value, and that changes as you move the mouse, but you can also type a value and it'll automatically do whatever the value is. It'll adjust to that value. If you want to change the value, you can just use the backspace key and then type something else and it'll do it again. So that was 1, that was 15, backspace to get rid of that, or 0.5. Whoops, that hasn't done it. 0.5, did 0.05. Oh, and then to set or to confirm, just press the left button or the enter key. So that just creates your basic bevel. So let's select another vertex. Activate the tool. We've also got a subdivide option. So let's type 0.5 again. And what we can do here is either use the middle mouse scroll button to scroll up or down, or if you're using a full keyboard, you can use the numerical plus or minus buttons. Whoops. And it'll subdivide the selection. So this is using the mouse scrolling button, middle mouse button. It's easier to do it this way because sometimes the plus and minus buttons don't work the way that you expect them to. So if you scroll it up just once, that subdivides once. If you do it again, it subdivides twice, 3 times. And as you see, looking at the, if you look at the outer edges of the selection that's made, that's your subdivisions. So for instance, if I set this in place, enter. So we've got, that's the primary edge. Whoops, that's the primary edge that was selected. So this full width. But what we created were 3 subdivisions of that initial edge because we moved the mouse up 3 times. So that's doing that with vertices. It's the same with edges and faces. So select an edge, mesh, edges, bevel, and you can do the same thing. So you can either move the mouse again or type a value, and then you can use the plus and minus keys or middle mouse scroll up or down to increase the number of subdivisions the edge has. So again, that's 3, and left click to confirm. And the same with faces. So if we switch to face select and do a bevel on this, and see what it does. Faces, where's bevel gone? Bevel at the top there. Whoop. And what that does, I don't know if that's visible. So move this so we can see the sides. Mesh, faces, bevel, and you can see what it's doing. And again, you can type a value and use the plus or minus keys or middle mouse scroll. So that's beveling that edge, that face selection 3 times. So we've got a simple bevel, we've got a subdivided bevel or vertex, we've got a subdivided beveled edge, and a subdivided beveled face selection. I can see YouTube say, what's Frenzy asking something about scrolling? What are you asking about scrolling, Frenzy? Oh, yes, thanks, Liana. Posting a link to the... Liana's posting a link to the YouTube, the imvu playlist. And you can also do that. So if I create a... Let me just drop in another cube. So we've got another cube, edit mode. So when you use bevel, you do have to pay attention to how it deforms the rest of the mesh relative to the bevel that you're doing. So we've got two edges selected. Edges, bevel. So let's subdivide that 3 times. What's the value? Offset. So let's do 0.25 and then return. So watch what happens at edges, because sometimes it'll distort the mesh where your bevel links up with other elements of the mesh that aren't affected directly by the bevel. They are not being beveled themselves, but they may terminate. So you do want to keep an eye out for that. So let's do that again, but for faces. So add another cube, select these two faces and bevel those. Whoop. So you see what's happened there. And this is an example of that. We've got these two upper faces selected, and that's it. Everything else is unselected. But because of their physical structure and their connections to the rest of the mesh, when you bevel these, it'll affect other elements of the mesh, because you are changing the shape of the face, or the faces, relative to the entire selection. Let me just do 0.25 for that as well, and then scroll up 3 times, and then press enter. So you get a slightly different outcome. So we've got a bevel, a complete bevel around the selections that we made, but a partial bevel where they terminate on the rest of the object. So be mindful of things like that as well. So that's beveling, basic beveling. You can use a modifier. Let's move that out of the way. Which is in the modifier properties stack. So click the modifier with the wrench or the spanner icon. Click the add modifiers, and then place the bevel modifier, but that tends to apply universally. So you can use either or depending on how much control you want over the object. or over the effect of the bevel and what it affects. So if you want more control, do it manually. If you want a global bevel or a more universal bevel, just use the modifier. Well, we're coming up on 2.5 hours, so I think we can probably call it quits. And hopefully we should be essentially back on schedule with the contest on Tuesday the 16th. So are there any more last minute quick to answer questions? You're very welcome, Liana. Liana's just saying thanks. Yes. So if Shannon Mack and Jinx bail next Tuesday for whatever reason, but it'd be a good one because that's 3 in a row. We might be able to animate the turkey or set that up for animation. So that should be interesting. So that's, I guess we should call it a night there. It's 2.5 hours we've been going, which is pretty good going. So I shall see you, or we shall see one another, Tuesday. Next Tuesday. Where we will hopefully put some of the Valentine's preview stuff into action. And see if we can get Shannon Mack to actually make something. So until then, cheerio.